Hi everyone, we are going to start. Welcome to the Women's Power, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom webinar towards the goal of social justice, women's empowerment, and sustainable development. So my name is Barbara Trojanowska, and I will guide you through a few technical issues, and then I'm going to hand you over to our excellent speakers. So first of all, you are all muted, so we can't hear you. And we can't see you either, so we can't see your webcam. This is the format of the webinar, and that is all fine. But we are going to have a good time for a discussion and for your questions and comments, and you will be able to raise your hand and say your question out loud or just type it. So I will explain how that works just before the Q&A. And if you encounter any problems, if you can't see the PowerPoint or if you can't hear us properly, try to quit the program and log in using the same link, and hopefully that will help. And finally, we are recording the session to put it online later, so please keep that in mind in case you want to make a comment or ask a question. So this webinar is hosted by the WILPF Academic Network, which is a think tank addressing the issues of gender, peace, and security understood broadly. And we are guided by the basic belief that feminist research can improve peace activism, and experiences from feminist peace movements can enhance scholarship and teaching. So if you are curious about the network, please visit our website, or if you've got any specific question, please feel free to contact me. And we still have our call for members open. So we invite members from Latin America, Africa, Eastern Europe, Asia, and the Pacific to apply for the membership in the academic network. And we invite scholars who are active researchers in the areas of WILPF's work, apply a gender perspective to their research, hold a PhD or higher degree or equivalent, and are members or friends of WILPF. So you can check it up on the website that is right now on the screen. And once again, if you've got any specific question about the academic network membership, please feel free to contact me. There are quite a few benefits also of being a member. All right, so the topic today is sustainable development and women's empowerment. And this is the priority theme of the UN Commission on the Status of Women. And we are going to approach this topic from two main interconnected angles. So first of all, we will be looking at the need to move resources, move money from militarization to conflict prevention. And then we will be talking about the need to empower women economically. And finally, we are tweeting, so please join our online discussion. Today, Olivia from WILPF Australia team is taking lead on Twitter, but she will be supported by Marina from Peace Women. So we'll be very happy if you join our discussion, and we will be using the hashtag WILPF Academic. Right, and our first speaker today is Abigail Ruane. Abigail is the Peace Women Program Director, and she is an expert on women's human rights, and she is particularly interested in the linkages between development and security. And she holds a PhD from the University of Southern California, and her award-winning PhD research was on negotiations over women's rights. So Abby, I'm going to unmute you. Abby, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Barbara. Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining. So as Barbara said, today we're going to be discussing issues around women's economic empowerment and sustainable development. This is part of our preparations by WILPF, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, on the 60th Commission on the Status of Women, which features this priority theme. I'll be providing some context, and then Radhika will then develop a training more around macroeconomics through a human rights lens. So to start out with, what does sustainable development mean? Slide, please. Sustainable development discussions, starting with the 1987 Brundtland Commission, have been organized around a holistic conception of well-being, defined by three different dimensions: environmental protection, social development, including human rights, and economic development. According to the groundbreaking Brundtland report, sustainable development is development that meets the need of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. This means transforming the current political economy, which is based more on exploitative growth and violence, and creating and moving towards a political economy that cultivates gender justice and peace. Unfortunately, however, the current development agenda is both narrow and relatively conflict blind. Slide, please. From this perspective, sorry, Barbara, do you mind switching the slide?
Hi, Abby, the slide was changed already. So gender equitable, sustainable development and conflict prevention.
Ah, okay. I don't see it, so there must be a delay.
Yeah.
Okay. From this perspective, gender equitable sustainable development can be understood as a form of violence and conflict prevention. According to Hudson et al. In their book, Sex and World Peace, the very best indicator and predictor of a state's peacefulness is not wealth, military expenditures, or religion. The best predictor is actually how well its girls and women are treated. Whether our country is democracy or not is irrelevant. Furthermore, other feminist research by Weldon and Son, in their article on feminist mobilization and progressive policy change, notes that the number one factor driving policy change on reducing violence against women is feminist activism, more than left-wing parties, numbers of women legislatures, or even national wealth. As this indicates, investing in gender equitable sustainable development is therefore a critical component of conflict prevention, and this continues to be a key gap area for sustainable development and just peace. Next slide, please. Despite the need for strengthened investment in gender equality for sustainable peace, the development agenda has been relatively narrow and conflict blind. In 2000, the Millennium Development Goals created 8 different goals, which were there to channel resources, support, and political will. They were developed through a rather elite process without very much broad consultation, and included global partnerships, poverty and hunger, universal primary education, environmental sustainability, HIV/AIDS, maternal health, child mortality, and gender equality. However, although these channeled significant support, they were relatively narrowly defined. For example, the Millennium Development Goal on gender equality focused only on equal access to primary and secondary education and improving maternal health. Next slide, please. Last year, this approach had a chance to change. On September 25th through 27th in 2015, member states adopted the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda at the UN Sustainable Development Summit. Building on the Rio conferences on sustainable development and responding to calls by civil society to be more holistic, these goals are much broader than the MGDs. They were also developed in a more inclusive process through years of consultations with member states, UN entities, civil society, and other stakeholders. WILPF has been promoting a conflict prevention approach to development that strengthens women's participation in rights for peace over these years, and is happy to see that the Sustainable Development Goals have included standalone goals on gender equality, Goal 5, and stable and peaceful societies, Goal 16. WILPF sees that the SDGs can be a critical tool for addressing the conflict prevention gap and must be implemented with a holistic framework that recognizes other obligations, including women's human rights and the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda. This includes financing for UN Security Council Resolution 1325 national action plans, and regulating arms that risk gender-based violence, consistent with both the Sustainable Development Goal 5 and 16, as well as UN Security Council Resolution 1325 and the arms trade, among other commitments. However, for this to be possible, the Sustainable Development Goals must be implemented through a human rights lens, ensuring that action realizes state obligations to respect, protect, and fulfill women's equal human rights. This human rights-based approach is critical both in developing aid and addressing national budgets, whether in macroeconomics or otherwise, to create a political economy of gender justice, human rights, and peace, rather than growth mindset. Next slide, please. I wanted to take a couple of minutes just to focus in more on a couple of the Sustainable Development Goals that are particularly relevant for gender justice and peace issues. First, the Sustainable Development Goal 5 is aimed at achieving gender equality and empowering all women and girls. Key targets under this goal include eliminating all forms of violence against all women and girls in the public and private spheres, including trafficking and sexual and other kinds of exploitation, recognizing and valuing unpaid care and domestic work through the provision of public services, infrastructure, and social protection policies, and the promotion of shared responsibility within the household and family, and ensuring women's full and effective participation and equal opportunities for leadership at all levels of decision-making in political, economic, and public life. Goal 5 in the Sustainable Development Goals, these addresses a variety of other targets as well. But all of these, whether or not they are interpreted within the context of indicators in the conflict arena, are relevant to member states across the conflict spectrum. For example, the issue of reducing violence against women and addressing trafficking is an issue that has been raised, including around conflict hotspots and transitional economies, as well as recent indications as connected to violent extremism in cases such as ISIS and Boko Haram. WILPF has had a special interest in this issue, given our own Secretary General Madeleine Rees's experience as a whistleblower who brought attention to widespread trafficking of women for sexual exploitation by UN peacekeepers in Bosnia and Herzegovina. WILPF has pushed for implementation of the UN's zero tolerance policy and use of international tools, such as the International Criminal Court, to promote accountability, such as under the ICC's slavery provisions. We've also pushed for strengthened accountability from member states and for private military corporations that states hire through strengthened vetting processes, blacklists, and action within the framework, not of morality, but of international law. The Sustainable Development Goals provide one additional mechanism for pushing on these actions for accountability and implementation. Another key issue under participation, ensuring the full and effective participation and leadership of women, is also relevant across the conflict spectrum, again, whether or not the indicators directly relate it to conflict contexts. Again, in this situation, WILPF has been actively advocating for substantive women's participation across the conflict spectrum, including situations such as conflict and humanitarian crises in Syria. Since the outbreak of violence and conflict in Syria, local civil society organizations, many of them led by women, have taken on heavier responsibilities of relief and recovery, community peace building and reconciliation, as well as documentation and support for victims of violence. Yet these groups have been largely absent from the international forums and processes discussing the future of Syria. These groups are active on the ground in Syria and refugee camps, working hard to restitch the fabric of society and build foundations for their country's future. Their perspectives and contributions are essential to any effort to end the violence and promote a sustainable resolution and just and democratic peace. Women's rights organizations in Syria and elsewhere are particularly important, not only as human rights holders, but also because of their collective actions for their communities and the connection between democracy, justice, and gender equality. Syrian women are already engaged in peacemaking in their communities, building networks on the ground to prevent violence, reconciling political and social differences, and deepening social cohesion and tolerance. WILPF has supported Syrian women, peacemakers, and others in pushing for a political solution to conflicts with women's human rights at the core for a sustainable and democratic peace, including through facilitating the first ever meeting of Security Council with Syrian women. We've worked with grassroots activists, women human rights peace defenders to develop alternative approaches to peace in mediation that go beyond the dividing power between two militarized sides or men with guns, and instead looking into alternative mechanisms and formats such as including women in formal delegations, including independent women's delegations, strengthening gender experts and expertise, including gendered documentation and position papers, and providing independent civil society forums, including fair representation of women, support for their participation through physical presence, resources, and technical support, strengthening their number and diversifying organizations and networks, and ensuring effective access and roles in peace and mediation processes. Broader representation and participation of women is critical to their human rights. It also leads parties to consider important issues not already on the table, move forward stalled processes, increase public support for negotiated settlements, and strengthen the accountability of belligerent parties to their own societies and each other. In doing so, research demonstrates that including participation of civil society can reduce the risk of peace processes failing by 64%. As with trafficking and otherwise, the SDGs provide one additional mechanism for pushing for actions on accountability on women's participation and implementation. Next slide, please. Sustainable Development Goal 16 is addressing promoting peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development and providing access to justice for all, and building effective and accountable and inclusive institutions at all levels. Some of the key targets in this goal include one on the rule of law and equal access to justice, which states that states need to promote the rule of law at the national and international levels and ensure equal access of justice for all. A target on reducing illicit financial and arms flow and strengthening recovery of stolen assets and combating forms of organized crime, and ensuring responsive, inclusive, participatory, and representative decision-making at all levels. Although we had hoped that this goal would be substantially stronger than it was, the integration of small arms and light weapons and access to justice and participation are all critical components of an agenda for sustainable peace. Issue of militarism and arms are critical for both financing gender equitable sustainable development and combating sexual and gender-based violence. WILPF sections in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and elsewhere have brought attention to how the proliferation of small arms and it has disproportionately impacted Congolese and other women, and how despite many national and international agreements, regulation of the arms trade remains limited. Women have brought attention to how the proliferation of arms and the supply of armed groups stress sexual violence, insecurity, and criminality. During the armed conflicts in eastern DRC, millions of women and girls threatened with weapons by armed groups were victims of systematic rape and other forms of sexual violence. Women and children are the majority of millions of refugees and internally displaced people, at least in the DRC, and refugee camps often do not take into consideration the specific needs of women. Disorganization in refugee camps also reinforces women's vulnerability. Small arms proliferation undermines women's capability to participate in conflict resolution, elections, and post-conflict reconstruction. Such proliferation of weapons jeopardizes human security and exacerbates human rights violations and illegal trade in natural resources. While there are other mechanisms that can be used to address the spread of arms, including the Arms Trade Treaty, which addresses the need for member states to limit the transfer of arms in cases where there is an overriding risk of gender-based violence. The Sustainable Development Goals provide one additional mechanism to follow up on this, in addition to CEDAW as well. Next page, please. So, we are just a week and a half away or so from the 60th Commission on the Status of Women. This is an opportunity to push your government to strengthen conflict prevention through implementation of the SDGs in a way that promotes women's human rights. When the Commission on the Status was originally created in 1954 or so, it was created to be both a spark plug for women's interests and also a mainstreamer of gender equality more broadly. It needs to be a strong platform to ensure that gender equality is addressed as a cross-cutting issue throughout the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as where it is directly incorporated under Goal 5 and gender-related targets. It should also be monitored in all relevant and follow-up mechanisms, ensuring that the Commission on the Status of Women and the high-level political forum ensure that local-level grassroots expertise, feminist organizing, and those at highest risk of being left behind are strongly represented in follow-up and review mechanisms. As we prepare for CSW, I urge all of you to use it as a platform to have your governments strengthen commitments on accountability for the SDGs through a human rights framework in order to ensure that we push for an economy that moves away from an economy of war towards an economy of gender justice and peace. Next slide, please. It is time to move from commitments to accomplishments and strengthen efforts at conflict prevention through divesting the war economy and investing instead in a political economy of gender justice and peace. I'd like to pass this on now to Radhika Balakrishnan, who will develop more extensively what a political economy of gender justice might look like and what we can do to make it happen. And if you're at CSW, next slide, please join us. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Abby. So we can all learn more about what Peace Women is doing during the CSW on their website, and they are doing a lot. They are having over 40 WILPF delegates joining them, so please just check it if you are going to CSW. And they are also having a very interesting event, which is a follow-up to the global study on the UN Security Council Resolution 1325. Some of you might be familiar with this study. One of the main recommendations of the study was exactly to address the growing militarization. And now we are going to have Radhika Balakrishnan. So Radhika is the faculty director at the Center for Women's Global Leadership and professor in Women's and Gender Studies at Rutgers University. And she is an expert on gender dynamics of the global economy and a very strong advocate of applying a human rights lens to macroeconomic policy. And her latest book that is coming out in a few months is entitled Rethinking Economic Policy for Social Justice, the Radical Potential of Human Rights. And last but not least, Radhika is a member of the WILPF Academic Network. So Radhika, you're unmuted. The floor is yours.
And I'm sharing my webcam.
Perfect.
Hello, everybody. I don't know what time zone you're all in, but it's very nice to meet you virtually. What I'm going to speak about today is from a report that actually just got completed this afternoon and got uploaded. So it's hot off the press. And it's a report that that's called Transforming Women's Work, Policies for an Inclusive Economic Agenda. And it's a report that the Center for Women's Global Leadership, the AFL-CIO, and the Solidarity Center have released together. And what we are trying to do is to sort of highlight the issues of economic empowerment in terms of economic policy issues. So I'm going to take you through the report. It's online, and you can get it at the end of this webinar and look at it in more detail. But I'll give you some of the highlights and focus on the recommendations. So as Abigail said, the focus of this CSW is on women's economic empowerment and the Sustainable Development Goals. And what we wanted to do was to really look at what women's economic empowerment meant in terms of issues of the the global economy, and also as women as workers in particular. So the first set of issues that we dealt with were the gendered effects of the current economic policy framework. So we look at macroeconomic policy. So what are the aspects of macroeconomic policy that have gendered effects? And I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, but will be available to answer questions at the end. So macroeconomic policy deals with two sets of issues. One is fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is the expenditure and taxation side of economic policy, so how much governments spend and what governments get in terms of revenue, usually in taxes or other forms of revenue. And monetary policy, which is how they deal with currency, exchange rates, and other aspects. So very quickly, what are examples of gendered effects of current economic policy? I think one, following up on what Abigail just talked about, is expenditure, and how much of government expenditure is going to the fulfillment of women's economic and social rights versus military expenditure and militarism in particular. Another particular example, given the world economy at this moment, is austerity policy. I mean, most of the world now seems to have taken on austerity as some form of policy that they think will help the economy. But not only is it been shown that austerity policy isn't very useful in terms of increasing economic growth, it has a very particular aspect in terms of what happens to women. So take, for example, an austerity policy that cuts healthcare expenditure as part of government budget cuts. Now, one of the things that is kind of assumed is that when healthcare expenditure is cut, somebody is going to take care of sick people. And in general, those are the people that are going to take care of the sick or the elderly or whoever used to be able to go to social welfare programs are going to be women. And so there's going to be an increase in women's unpaid labor with macroeconomic policies such as austerity, which is cutting budgets. The second, and I'll do this, we'll go through this fairly quickly, is monetary policy. Again, I'll use an example from research that Diane Elson and I did in the U.S. and Mexico, which is that the U.S. in terms of monetary policy has a dual mandate, which is that the Federal Reserve, which is the central bank of the United States, has a mandate to increase employment, but it also has a mandate to inflation low. So at moments of economic crisis, as we've had in 2008, the U.S. Federal Reserve was able to increase, to really follow the increase in employment as one of the goals of monetary policy, since inflation was very low. Mexico, on the other hand, has inflation targets, which is something that's imposed on many countries, or self-imposed in many countries, but often with the IMF instigation, that they have to have a, let's say, 3% inflation target. So Mexico during the crisis could not have the flexibility in monetary policy as the U.S. in terms of being able to increase employment. Now, obviously, increasing employment has a very gendered impact in terms of jobs lost, ability to make a living, and other issues. So the next issue is trade policy, and each of these issues we could spend 2 hours on each of these issues. So please forgive me that we're taking this very quickly through all of them, but I guess that's the structure of a webinar. Now, trade policy has sadly been very, very focused on increasing business access rather than enhancing labor rights and regulation. And the kind of regulatory schemes that current trade policies have followed have really decreased women and workers' ability to organize. It has increased precarious work and has been a driver of the race to the bottom in terms of workers' rights and in terms of wages. And we see this all over the world, and I think labor organizers are really highlighting the problems of the trade policies in terms of labor. And I think the more recent organizing around the world by women's groups against the TPP, the Transnational Pacific Partnership, has been an example of women organizing in terms of trade policy. Another example of trade policy is the weakening of labor regulations and eliminating of tariffs that take place in the opening up of trade. So one of the things that happens with the elimination of tariffs is that it actually decreases the amount of revenue that governments can get, and they're not necessarily replaced with higher taxes on corporations that come in. And so the ability to fulfill expansionary fiscal policy with sufficient revenue is decreased when taxes on tariffs in particular are reduced. So there's a connection between fiscal policy and trade policy, and also there's been, because of the changes in regulation, there's been an increase in tax avoidance, evasion. I think there's, I think everyone around the world is looking at how there's all these tax havens, and we need international coordination in terms of increasing regulation around that, and therefore decreasing government's ability to have the resources to fulfill and their human rights obligations. Could we go to the next slide then? Okay, sorry, my notes are a little different from the... Okay, labor force participation rates. Is there a slide before that? I'm sorry, I seem to be... No, Barbara, is there a slide before the one that you just had?
Nope.
Oh, okay. No, I got it. I'm there. Don't worry, I got it. I think I mixed up my notes and they weren't numbered. Sorry, I apologize. The changing nature of work. So we started by talking about economic policy and kind of the neoliberal agenda in terms of macroeconomic policy. But there's also a changing nature of work. And there's a flexibilization of production. So production is now, the kind of old example of, the classic example is the Ford Motor Company, that all the people work in a factory, they bring in all the resources that are needed to produce the car, and people work together to make a car. What's happened over the last 25 years is that kind of model of production has changed, and we have much more of a flexible production line, so that parts are made in one country and other parts are made in another country, and so it actually changes the kind of work that is taking place. There's been a shift towards more precarious work, where companies, subcontract their work, and therefore the form of labor has become more precarious, and and it's becoming less and less skilled. It's more low skilled work that is being promoted. Now, in terms of labor force participation rates, what we see is that in general, all around the world, there's been a decrease in, or not a decrease, there's been fewer women who participate in the labor force than men globally. These have changed in certain regions. For example, in Asia, with the opening up of trade, there were more women that were participating in the labor force, but often at lower wages. And so we need to look at what is limiting women's labor force participation rate. We also need to look at what are the reasons for the gender wage gap, which is the gap in wages between men and women. Is it because of discrimination between men and women, or is it because of segregation in particular kinds of jobs? It tends to be that jobs where women are dominant have lower wages. One of the examples that I remember reading many years ago was a job ad in the newspaper where it asked for a bilingual secretary. I mean, this was many years ago. A bilingual secretary with typing skills and ability to, I forget what, maybe internet access. And it was, $5 an hour. I'm making up the numbers, but you get the idea. And then right next to it was another ad that said, need someone who can take boxes from a truck and load it and load a vending machine, and that was $20 an hour. So if you just look at the two types of job in terms of the skill and human capital required for those two jobs, the ones that are female dominated, often, nurses, school teachers, healthcare workers, care workers in general, are paid a lot less than others are. So we need to, in terms of challenges and barriers, we need to look at, what's limiting labor force participation. Going back to the first one, even things that you don't normally think about in terms of labor force participation, access to transportation, safe transportation that can get people to jobs, access to sanitation. Are there proper bathrooms that women can go to? Many people have looked at access to sanitation and education among young girls, but there's also a lot of issues in terms of labor force participation. And then the last is to look at, in terms of challenges and barriers, is the issue of women's unpaid work. And this is a large issue. I mentioned it before when we looked at macroeconomic policy and austerity programs. But in general, women's unpaid work is a huge challenge and a barrier to women's ability to participate in the paid labor force. And so, I mean, the three things that need to be done in some ways is one is to recognize women's unpaid work. I mean, one of the things that is not really discussed at a macro level, at an economic level, is the extent of women's unpaid work. And what are examples of women's unpaid work? One would be taking care of the family. So they're cooking breakfast before they go to work in the morning. They're making sure their kids have food. They have lunch, or if it's not provided, and then they come home. And as soon as they come home, they get back from work and they have to cook dinner. So that's if someone has a job. And so, what are the ways in which unpaid work actually hinder women from having, good jobs, decent jobs, and have them have more precarious jobs? And I'll give you an example of this unpaid work from research that I'd done several years ago. And I was in Sri Lanka, and there was a group of workers who worked in the backyard of a neighbor's house, and they worked for a toy company that was painting wooden dolls. And I'd actually started by going to the toy manufacturer's office, and he'd said that they closed down the factory where the workers were all together because the workers would organize and go on strike, and it was, not doing well with his business. And so instead he had women go into the basically flexibilization of production, what I talked about before. And when we went to visit the women who were doing the manufacturing, they had, it was called subcontracting, but they had no contract, so, it wasn't clear whether they would get continuous employment. The woman who owned the house, or whose house it was, had to pay for all the equipment and electricity. And they, the person who owned the manufacturing company really paid no overhead for these women. But when I asked the women why they did that, what many of them said to me was actually very interesting. I mean, what they wanted was secure employment with pension and social protection and all the things that most workers want to do. But the reason why they ended up in these jobs, I think, is a classic example of the problems of unpaid work. Is the one woman said that by working in the backyard of her neighbor's house, she could go home and feed her family and come back. Her kids, many of the kids were actually being watched while they worked, so that there was no need, there was no proper daycare, but the children were safe. Another woman, a young woman, said that the transportation to the factory where there was a better job was not safe, and that this way she could work and save enough money in order to, her case was she wanted to save money so she could get married. And an older woman said that the transportation and move, the closest job, she was working in a rubber factory, and that it was just too hard on her body, and this created a better job. So here are, 4 examples of why women chose precarious work because of the issue of unpaid work. So I think we need to really look at unpaid work. And the 3 things that we need to do is to recognize unpaid work. It's a huge contribution to the economy that's not really discussed and spoken about. We need to reduce it. And in order to reduce it, we need to look at infrastructure. So, for example, I gave you care issues, but, women walk miles to get water for their families, or firewood for their families, or there are many things that women spend a lot of time doing unpaid work that could be reduced by investment in infrastructure. So that's one issue. And then it needs to be reorganized as well, right? So it needs to, I think the burden of care work has to be distributed in the family in a more equitable way. And there are aspects of the care work that can be done through social protection and social programs. So unpaid work is a really important aspect of looking at women's participation in the labor force. Can I have the next slide? And we already talked about this earlier on in terms of the changing nature of work. More and more what we're seeing is precarious hiring arrangements. The idea that you would work in a company for 30 years and get a pension and retire really very few countries have that model anymore. So precarious hiring arrangements are the norm. We're seeing more and more trade in global supply chains, so that you have companies that many workers don't actually know who they're working for when they have a job. Again, going back to research that I'd done many years ago in Asia, I'd started doing this research. It was called the hidden assembly line, and we started doing this research by a lot of work had been done on looking at, for example, following the supply chain from, say, Walmart in the US and trying to see where it ended up in what country and who was producing those goods. And so our idea was that we were going to go and start with the workers on the ground in Asia and then see if we could find where these goods actually ended up. And what was interesting in this research, and I think the supply chain analysis is really important, is that on both sides there's kind of a middle where you don't actually know. There's some goods obviously that you know where it started and where it ended up, but the supply chains go through so many levels that it's hard to make a direct link between who's selling the product and what the product is and where it's being made and the kind of employment the workers who are getting it. So, you know, I don't know, Nike company and the shoes that they're making, to connect it to actual companies that are producing them to Nike is not that easy, right? So I think that it's really important in terms of looking at women's labor to understand the relationship between working conditions and global supply chains. There's also the issue of technology and what technology is doing to change the nature of work. And the conversation has been about sort of I think they're calling the gig economy, and how technology is changing, again, the nature of work, not necessarily for the better, but to make work more precarious and informal. The informal sector is a huge sector and a big sector that's occupied by women, workers in particular. And so that, and here again, this is a sector that does not have social protection, has no pension, no health care, so very little access to what we call decent jobs in the ILO. But is one that's dominated by women. So we need to look at, you know, what are the characteristics of informal sector, how do you organize in the informal sector so that they get to have better working conditions, and what are the kind of collective actions we need to address this changing work. I mean, there's been at the ILO organizing by home-based workers to try and get conventions on home-based workers, which are more and more prevalent around the world. So I think, again, the changing nature of work is something that we need to look at. The next slide. So the next few slides are a little dense, and the reason they're dense is that they're part of the recommendations that we're making in this report. And so I'm not going to go through all of them, and you will all get the report at the end of this session. But I just want to highlight some of them. I think Abigail mentioned this earlier on, and so did Barbara. I think one is the full implementation of human rights instruments in terms of economic and social rights. And we need to look at the Covenant on Economic and Social Rights. We need to look at CEDAW and a whole set of human rights instruments that actually address women's labor issues, but I don't think are used enough in terms of addressing the kind of empowerment discussions that often take place, especially in these international fora. I mean, so often when we talk about women's empowerment, it's to sort of, you know, microcredit and let's, you know, increase women's access to entrepreneurial work, which I'm not saying is a bad thing necessarily. Often it is a bad thing, but we need to look at it in terms of larger structural issues and macroeconomic issues. So we need to design macroeconomic policy to mobilize resources to look at women's economic rights. We talked about what some of those aspects are, but I think a deeper analysis of gender and macroeconomic policy is really important when we look at women's economic empowerment. We need to invest in physical and social infrastructure. Again, just the example I used in terms of just water and sanitation or firewood, but there's so many ways in which physical and social infrastructure, transportation, access to land, and resources that could encompass a huge amount of things. Reform of trade and development policy to look at long-term growth and accountable business practices. I think we need much more scrutiny from the women's movement at large in terms of regulation of businesses and what businesses are getting away with. I live in the United States, and probably everyone in the world knows we're going through a really insane election process here, where a big part of the conversation is about the role of business and how business is kind of usurping our democracy in terms of being able to take over. I mean, they can fund as much as they want to any candidate, and so chambers of commerce are more important than people's participation these days. So it's a really important issue. Again, how do we address the structural barriers to decent work and equal participation in the labor market? And 6, really important, is protect worker and community organizing. I think more and more what we're seeing is more violence in terms of people's organizing, especially around economic and social rights issues. When you see women's groups and people's groups organizing against land grabbing, what we see is the state coming in and implementing what businesses want and militarizing those areas. And so there's a real connection between people's organizing and the militarization and violation of human rights defenders in many parts of the world. So I think organizing is really important. Next slide. I think this one, implementation of international frameworks in terms of gender and economic rights. I've already mentioned that. We could go to the next one. I've already mentioned it, but I think these are important ones to highlight again, which is to collect data on unpaid work and informal work, because a lot of times the problem is we don't actually know how big it is. What are the actual numbers in terms of, if you counted unpaid work in your GDP, what it would actually amount to. I mean, there's some estimates of that work, but we need to collect data and ask for data. And informal sector work, again, is important for us to have information and data. We need to look at unpaid work and social reproduction as a way to assess economic policy and macroeconomic policy. We need to look at budgets in terms of gender responsive budgets and evaluate current and future impacts on women's rights and well-being in terms of as a way to hold budgets accountable rather than merely looking at sort of growth. And I think, especially since this is Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, I think it's really important for all of us to look at government budgets in terms of the extent of military spending versus spending on women's economic and social rights. And we can go to the next set. I don't think I need to highlight that. Invest in physical and social infrastructure, access to education. I mentioned before, the relationship between education and access to sanitation. A lot of young girls around puberty end up dropping out of school because they don't have access to sanitation. So very specific gender barriers to inclusion is important. Quality health care, parental leave, sick leave, and others measures to reduce unpaid work that we've already discussed before is another set of our recommendation. And physical infrastructure for schools, hospitals, transportation systems. The next slide. Reform trade and development policy. I mean, I think it used to be in the 90s there was a lot of organizations that looked at gender and trade, and somehow they've decreased Not sure whether it was a lack of funding, and also this, the WTO kind of being stalled for a while. But I think it's really important for us to look at trade policy and understand the gendered impacts of current trade policy, and investment policy, both trade and investment policy. We need to look at it in terms of promoting women's economic and social rights with a particular attention to labor and labor organizing. And I keep saying this, but I think it's really important, is we need to look at the regulation of business. And so far, a lot of the regulation are voluntary, and I think we need more than voluntary regulation to promote decent work for both men and women. And to not have the Sustainable Development Goals be undermined by particular trade policy. The next slide. Address structural barriers. I think we've looked at some of these, but social protection is a really important one, and to look at social protection with regard to employment and migration status, which is something that we're talking about around the world. Create a living wage floor for all workers in both the formal and informal markets, regardless of the nature of the work. And create robust gender-inclusive labor rights and monitoring that look at issues that are gender-specific, particularly gender-based violence and discrimination. And also look at the intersection between gender, race, and nationality in terms of social protection. The next slide. We need to get better information, and I think we've already talked about recognize, reduce, and redistribute care work, and regulate business, and in many aspects of regulation. We could go one more. No, I think the next slide. Yeah. We need to look at labor, protect workers and community organizing, protect the right of freedom of association and assembly, speech to allow women activists to organize unions and other civil society organizations and engage in policy debate, protect labor activists and other human rights defenders from retaliation, which I think is really critical, and promote labor laws and improve bargaining power. And I think, given that we're a global community, even on this webinar, I think organizing of labor, we often think of it as local, that we organize at local levels, but I think we need to organize across borders because work is now global, and so therefore organizing has to also be global. The next slide. And that was it. Okay, so that was good. We're ending with a moment of promoting organization and women's collective action, which I think is a good place to do it. And so there's the report, and I've basically spoken from the report, so you can all download it and read it on your own.
All right.
Barbara, it's all you.
Thank you, Radhika. That was extremely informative. And also, we are going to put this presentation online later. So in case if you want to go in deep or look through all the points that Radhika wanted to make, it will be available online. So we will be able to check that out. And also, I'm going to check the report that Radhika, I'm going to send the report that Radhika just presented to all of you. So you should get a link right now and you can check it out. And now we are opening the floor to questions and comments. So if you've got any question, you can ask it in basically two ways. You can click on the hand button and raise your hand, and I will unmute you and give you the floor. or you can alternatively type the question and I will read it out loud for you. So I will give you a few minutes. And if you've got any questions, so please raise your hand, or alternatively, please type it. Okay, so while everyone is a little bit shy, I will ask one question. Yeah. So I'm actually wondering, what can researchers do to contribute to empowering women economically? You, Radhika, mentioned about gathering data. What else can we do? And also, how can we make sure that our research is not basically, or our data is not misused to the opposite?
So I'll answer the first part, which is what can researchers do. I think researchers, I mean, there are many roles for researchers to do. One is to unearth things that people don't know. I mean, I used examples of, we don't know enough about the informal sector. I think in terms of feminist economics in general, we need more people to do that. I'm not saying it's the only field by any means. But I think that one of the issues in terms of gender is that there's not enough research. I mean, there's some, and obviously a lot more now than there was 25 years ago. But I think looking at this, and also researchers working with organizers. I mean, I think this report that I talked about is an example of academic institutions working with labor organizers to come together. I mean, this report is a result of a meeting where we brought both researchers and organizers together to say what are the issues that needed to be highlighted. So I think there's a big role for researchers to work with activists. I don't know, I myself don't, I'm a activist researcher, so I don't distinguish myself that much from being both. So I think we could do both. Does that answer your question, Barbara? I'm not sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So we've got a few questions from the audience. There is a question from Raylene Reevy. How can trade policy, protect women in the security workplace from violence, in particular those that witness atrocities, potential whistleblowing situations?
Well, I did, Barbara, can you repeat that last part? I didn't hear you, sorry.
How can policy, especially trade policy, protect women in the security workforce from violence, in particular those that witness atrocities, potential whistleblowing situations? I'm wondering whether that's a question about the military and how we can protect women in the security sector from violence.
Well, I mean, in terms of particular trade policies, I don't know whether, I mean, it's very interesting. I've been doing this project recently, and one of the European Union has a policy called GSP Plus, and so if you sign trade policies with the European Union, there's a set of kind of conditionalities, if you'd say, that you have to follow. But what's very interesting about it, and I am not an expert on this, but what I've been understanding from the reading I've been doing is that it actually requires you to adhere to international human rights standards. And it has a whole list, including the Covenant on Economic and Social Rights, CEDAW, and all of these policies. So I think that might be one example, if you want to look at specific trade policies, of one attempt in which international human rights standards are being asked to be adhered to if you go into trade agreements with the EU. But other than that, I think it would be local level protection in terms of organizing, I think. Either of you want to take that on in terms of?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a really good response. And maybe just to add, I think that looking at what the regulations are on things like private military companies, and how the regulations around trade impact the investments that we can make. And again, I think I'm sort of stretching on this as well, but I think that that would be interesting to think about as well.
All right, thank you. I hope, Raylene, that was your question. And if you would like to make additional comment, or if we didn't really respond to your question, please just raise your hand and I will unmute you. And we've got some other questions that are typed, and I will read them. And just that you know that you can also raise your hand and we can unmute you and you can take the floor. So we have a question from Anna Teresa. I will read the whole comment. Thank you so much to all speakers. Such a great way to stay engaged in the academic field, having finished university. And when we say the SDGs must be implemented through a human rights lens, what do you mean? Through a mechanism of the UN Human Rights Council, through the Universal Periodic Review mechanism, or do we need to establish something new to implement and monitor the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals? I'm trying to figure out what might be best. So I wondered, what are your thoughts? So I think it's a question to both of you.
Sure, I can maybe take a first stab at that. So I think that when you look at implementing the Sustainable Development Goals through a human rights lens, there's a number of different ways you can go about it. One is that the main accountability mechanism of the high-level political forum needs to be laid out in a way that addresses human rights standards. So one of the challenges that is coming up around this is they are currently finalizing the indicator framework for the Sustainable Development Goals and targets that have been developed. And although there is a huge number of indicators, those indicators are not always perfectly related to the human rights standards involved. So for example, on the target on small arms proliferation under the peace goal, the target talks about the proliferation of arms and financial illicit arms and financial flows, but the way that it's worded doesn't address the commitments that already exist under the Arms Trade Treaty on regulating arms that impact gender-based violence. So because of that disconnect, there is a risk that the monitoring of the Sustainable Development Goals will not be at the level that it should be, that upholds both women's human rights and commitments on demilitarization and disarmament, among otherwise. So one thing to do is to ensure that there is sort of a cross-sectional approach for accountability. So to push for the high-level political forum to not just have the reviews that it undertakes be through the SDGs lens, but that it be connected to human rights bodies. So you could push for integration into SDGs under the Human Rights Council and through the Universal Periodic Reviews and any shadow reports that you work on. Same thing with CEDA, of course, with shadow reports there. And you could also use the Human Rights Framework to provide any kind of contributions to the high-level political forum. And if there is substantive women-led civil society engagement in that regard, that would be one forum for doing it. Alternatively, you could do it externally if it's not built into the system, which is still being decided. Radhika, do you have anything to add?
That was profound. That was perfect.
All right.
Great.
So I'm going to unmute Anya Rekmi, so you will be able to speak. So Anya, the floor is yours. All right. So I'm going to read another question. There is a question from Sunita Bisan. Thank you. In terms of gender mainstreaming and recognizing unpaid work, increasing gender balance, 30% targets in decision making, and reducing gender discrimination, but it's rather fragmented thus far. How can we ensure SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, would be more successful? What about synergies on all other commitments, human rights, climate, and so on?
Sorry, Barbara, could you just repeat that one more time? Or
Yeah,
did you
I
catch
didn't
that?
quite get that either.
Okay.
In terms of gender mainstreaming and recognizing unpaid work, increasing gender balance of 30% targets in decision making and reducing gender discrimination, it's been rather fragmented thus far. How can we ensure sustainable development goals would be more successful? What about synergies on all other commitments, human rights, climate, and so on?
Okay. Maybe I'll just take a first stab at this as well. I think what the question is getting at is that currently in the UN system, there's a big problem. And the problem is that there is a huge fractionation, there's a huge division and a huge siloing among different UN entities. You know, the Security Council focuses on security, the General Assembly focuses more on development, security and development conversations don't really connect as they should, and that's just, you know, two main areas. So because of the way the UN is set up in, you know, a million different fragmented entities, there's a real problem that it goes at cross purposes with itself, and that even when there is good intent to uphold the human rights obligations and peace obligations that it was created to uphold, that it is sort of shooting itself in the foot by the way it's structured. And so one of the things that WILPF really works at is for a more integrated approach that connects these discussions of gendered issues with security and development and promotes an integrated approach to human security based in women's lived experiences rather than military state security. The way we've done that is by a combination of linking different UN entity advocacy together and then linking local to global work. So for example, in the cases of the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Colombia, those are two examples where we pushed for recommendations based on the Women, Peace, and Security agenda to be taken on by the CEDAW committee, and were successful in that regard. And in the case of Colombia, that was just one part of a broader movement building that ended up pushing successfully for women to be at the peace table. So that is one way that you can overcome those silos, is by connecting the dots throughout the UN entities to streamline and bring more coherence to the work around a women, human rights, and security and peace framework. The other thing that we do is there's a disconnect between local and global. You know, in 2016, we have spent a lot of time coming up with commitments, and we have a really strong normative framework on human security, on human rights, and otherwise. But there's a big disconnect between our big commitments and the lack of accomplishments on the ground. So the way that WILPF works is we really do sort of a two-part approach where we amplify the voices of grassroots women, peace activists, and human rights defenders in international and regional spaces, so that international policy is informed by their experience rather than policymakers just living in a bubble. And then we also work with our sections and partners worldwide to leverage these international commitments at the local level. So for example, in Nigeria, one of our sections has done some amazing work on using Train the Trainers programs, where they've trained about 7,000 women in the last 2 or 3 years by only training women who train 30 other women to do economic empowerment measures. They sort of do their own businesses and then use 1325 to combat gun violence in their communities. So I think wherever we are, we're coming from different places, but in the work that we do, we can try to push that extra mile and link to conversations that we're not always in, and try to make more coherence and cohesion around women human rights framework and commitments for sustainable gender justice and peace.
I could add, I'll take a different take on the question. And one of the things that, in terms of unpaid work, that we did several years ago was really to work with special rapporteurs who were looking at different issues, in particular Magdalena Sepulveda, who was a special rapporteur on extreme poverty. And we worked with her to sort of bring in these kind of macro issues and connections to unpaid work into her mandate. And so if you look at the reports that she's done, she really took that on and connected the human rights issues to unpaid work in probably the best way that it's been done in the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights. So I think making those connections, and what Abigail just said, there's the different parts of the UN. It's as though I mean, it's really funny because I'm not identified very much as someone who works on human rights. And I was just telling a friend of mine that I was at the UN, and she said, "Oh, when did you get back from Geneva?" Because the idea that someone who's working on human rights would be speaking in New York, because human rights happens in Geneva, development happens in New York. And I think those linkages need to be made better. I'm not saying it's not, but I think they need to be made at the structural level and the advocacy level as well.
Thank you. Anya Regi wrote the question. Could you elaborate a little bit more on how entrepreneurship can help women in the third world countries to encourage economic empowerment, and what specific action can be taken by entrepreneurial ventures to empower women's participation in partnership with private sector development? So how entrepreneurship can help women in the third world countries?
Well, I have to answer that in two ways. One of the things I was saying is that often when they talk about women's empowerment, they only talk about entrepreneurship. And so often women are asked to start a business and sell something so that they can have economic empowerment. And having traveled to a lot of places where there's huge microcredit programs where women are encouraged to be entrepreneurs, often what many of the women that I've met wanted was a wage, with pensions and a job, rather than having to take on the risk of starting a business and making it viable. So on the one hand, there's some problems with always going to entrepreneurship. On the other hand, when women do want to become entrepreneurs, I think there's a lot of barriers to their ability to do that in terms of access to finance, to capital, to bank accounts, kind of sexist attitudes about women owning their own business. So I want to answer that in two. One is that pushing for entrepreneurship as the only answer to women's empowerment, I think, is a problem. So I think we need to look at work and how we might want to get decent work for women. But on the other hand, if women want to be entrepreneurs, we also need to look at what are the issues that are prohibiting them from being able to access what they need in order to create businesses. And again, I'm working on a project right now where there's real legal hindrances to getting access to credit if you want to start a business. Some countries won't give women loans. They have to give it to the male head of household. So when women do want to increase entrepreneurship, I think we need to look at what the barriers are. But I think we should also be careful to not make entrepreneurship the answer to women's poverty alleviation.
Thank you, Radhika. Abby, would you like to add anything to this question?
No, I think she covered it. Thanks.
Okay. We have another question from Samanti Gunavardhana. I think it's great that we are having this conversation because there is a very strong interaction between WILPF work and the work discussed. Recently, the work band working with Oxford University has proposed that we establish a special economic zone on the Jordan-Syria border to employ refugees. This is so problematic in many respects. The main one is the murky status of labor and refugee rights. As most people know, socio-economic zones are not known for upholding labor, women's human rights. How can we ensure that we can address these multiple forms of precariousness? How do we ensure this sort of conversations that we are having now are sustained?
That's a hard one. I think we have to. I mean, I think one is we have to continue to organize, and be vigilant, and I think we are, and to get into more spaces in which we can bring these issues up in to policymakers so that they listen. I'm not being very imaginative with my answer. Abby, maybe you have a better answer to the question.
I mean, I think it's a really hard question. I think that one thing that is really helpful, this actually goes back to Barbara's comment earlier about what can feminist researchers do to contribute to advocacy, is really to just provide a feminist analysis of what's going on and to bring attention to how there have been serious problems, including like in the areas of the maquiladoras and elsewhere, where special zones and special rights or special spaces mean really a reduction in the quality of life, of rights, of existence in the world. So I think that a lot of times that there are good intents on these things, but they are not accompanied by feminist analysis. And then, of course, there's just the ongoing issue of when there are recommendations to take action in this kind of way, there's always needs to be a push for engagement and participation of the women involved in those situations to find out if it's something that they think would be useful or not, and if not, if they have other recommendations and what they're doing to address the concerns that are trying to be addressed. Too often we are faced with situations where external actors try to save women without asking their feedback or whether or not they want those actions to be taken, and that usually ends up creating problems rather than recognizing on the work that is being done and engaging more proactively.
Yeah, I want to add one more thing, is that I think this kind of discussion that WILPF is putting together in terms of engaging academics to have these kind of larger discussions is an important way to do it as well. And as I said, I am an academic, and at least in the United States, I don't think it's as much all around the world. But academics are not rewarded for participating in discussions with the activists. And so I think having these kind of fora to deliberately do this, I think is an important step for breaking down some of the barriers, because I think we all are on the same side and we need to figure out how to work together better, because the issues we're dealing with are fairly huge.
Thank you. We have one more question. So before I read it, I would just like to invite you, if you've got any questions, we still have a few minutes, or if you've got any comments, because so far we are having only questions, but we are also very open to your comments. So the question is from Raylene. Would addressing policy of multinationals regarding violence against female workers and ability to engage them actually counter violence against women in those same war zones, peacekeeping by those same multinationals?
Sorry,
Can you repeat that? Yeah, I'm sorry, I
Yeah.
didn't get that either.
Yeah. Would addressing policy of multinationals regarding violence against female workers actually counter violence against women in those same war zones peacekeeping by those same multinationals. Raylene,
Okay.
I will try to unmute you, and maybe you can reframe the question if that's okay with you.
Yeah, that would be good.
Oh, hi. The question really is look into what's currently coming out, and I mean it's been something that's sort of ongoing with the United Nations and multinationals working for the United Nations, where we look at violence towards women and children in peacekeeping zones. And with the example in mind of Catherine Bolkovec, who blew the whistle on DynCorp. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, but with her example and looking at the other side of the coin of we found out about what was happening to women in Bosnia and rape and violence, and so we could address that part of the situation. But I'm just querying whether what she came out about, the other flip side of that coin, or the gift to address, I would think would be something to the effect of looking at engaging women in those particular workforces, in particular peacekeeping, and I mean it might even have to do about increasing the numbers of female peacekeepers, but also more so about engaging women that work for multinationals. I mean, because we know about engaging women in the defense force, but I think my question is more so about engaging women that work in multinationals, and if a way of writing into policy things to do, because I'm not a policy person, but to looking at I guess policy about violence against female workers, maybe that might be a way of almost getting in the back door, so to speak, of policy where we can engage female staff, and that might be a way of countering violence, in particular, I guess, violence that men impose on women in peacekeeping and war zones.
Can I ask a clarifying question? When you say women who work for multinationals, what multinational corporations, UN agency, what do you mean?
Well, I guess this particular question is driven at private security. And when I say that too, I'm also inclusive of security companies such as Serco and GeForce, and that deal with asylum seekers, and multinationals such as DynCorp and so on, that deal with peacekeeping missions of the United Nations. And so I'm just putting that question out there, I guess, as a seed for someone like yourself, and someone like in a legal sense, like Madeleine Rees, that I now understand works for Women International League for Peace and Freedom, to look at the other side of the coin that Catherine Bolkovec presented to us. And just recently we found out about violence against women and children in the Congo and so on, where actual peacekeepers, these workers that work for these multinationals, are the people, in fact, that are inflicting violence to women in these zones. And if we considered a way to get into the policy, present, when deals are made, where we can have a reason to engage the actual female workers, because, if we looked at Catherine Belkovic's example, wouldn't it be the female workers that would, I guess, hold accountability, so to speak? And I guess that's when I incorporated the whistleblowing aspect into my question.
Thanks for that. I think I can maybe take a stab at a response.
Okay, awesome.
So I think what you're raising is the idea of how do we address sexual exploitation and abuse conducted by peacekeepers and multinational corporations in a way that builds on advocates for more effective action, and bringing attention to the case of the whistleblower, Madeline Reese, Catherine Bakovic is one way of doing it. I think the question certainly is one that comes up repeatedly, and it's useful to explore all options when you're dealing with such a difficult problem. However, I think it's really critical to be very clear that there's a difference between engaging women and taking a feminist analysis of a problem. And in this regard, it's actually very problematic to put the burden of action just on women for upholding women's rights. Women in these kinds of corporations and entities are usually facing their own barriers to their participation and to general engagement. And it shouldn't just be up to women to strengthen women's rights. This is not a women's issue just in itself. It's a human rights issue. It's an international humanitarian law issue. It's an issue that needs to be addressed within an international legal framework. So while, of course, we can hope for and reach out to women leaders as allies, not all women are peace activists or will be allies, and there's also women who actively engage in violence. So I think it's very critical to be clear about the difference. And I think in terms of how to go about it, there's a variety of different ways. As I mentioned earlier, leveraging international legal tools such as the International Criminal Court, pushing for more accountability under the UN Zero Tolerance policy, and then looking for other opportunities to hold member states accountable, because even though there are private military corporations out there that we can then push for action on, a lot of times the commitments that are involved are voluntary. And under human rights frameworks, member states are actually responsible for respecting, protecting, and fulfilling women's human rights, and that means addressing the actions even of non-state actors within their framework. So I think that making sure that there is not just a focus on transnational actors who then are given a pass, but that accountability mechanisms are addressed from a broader perspective that emphasizes a human rights framework is really important. Radhika, do you want to add?
Yeah, the one thing that was great, Abigail, I would add also that we need to really look at militarism as an answer that is being pushed all around the world, right? And so it's both, I agree that holding these non-state actors accountable is very important to human rights standards, and there have been some cases that have been tried. For example, the company that had killed people in Iraq, they tried to bring them to court. So I think the more and more that states use private actors for their military interventions, we need to look at that as a regulatory issue that we need to deal with. And also just a larger question, which is that, in the world, militarism seems to be the answer, and it's I think as feminists, we know that there's a real problem with it, and there's a certain kind of masculinity that comes with it. And so I think we need to look both in terms of holding non-state actors accountable and looking at peace and security from a feminist perspective.
Absolutely.
All right, that was a great answer from both of you. We are going to take one more question and then we'll be wrapping up. So the question from Anya is it possible to address, or actually the question will be, what specific action can be taken to ensure gender equality and empowering women and girls to achieve economic empowerment in war-torn countries? So what specific action can be taken for gender equality and women's empowerment in conflict countries?
Specific action.
Yeah, it's a huge question, I believe.
It's a huge question. I mean, I don't know if there's a specific answer to.
I mean, I'd say that based on the research, one of the best things that you can do is invest in feminist movement building. I mean, based on the research that has come out recently, gender equality is the #1 predictor of peace. Feminist movement building is the #1 predictor of policies on reducing violence against women. And we know that feminist movements and women human rights defenders and peace activists are the ones who are making the gendered and militarism analysis that looks at these structural changes that need to happen and are building the leadership that needs to be developed in order to create change. So anything that you can do for feminist movement building, I think, will address a variety of different problems, from the militarized global political economy, where we have a $1.7 trillion arms trade, to the exclusive participation processes that we're stuck with, in a way that is really just critical for strengthening women's human rights and long-term peace.
Yeah, I think that's a great step, and also making sure that feminist analysis is broad, that feminist analysis looks at economic policy, it looks at foreign policy, it looks at the reasons why we have refugees, so that when we talk about a feminist take on issues, that we look at all aspects of issues that affect women's lives. And I think, especially in terms of refugees, we're in a look at the way the world is right now, and so feminists need to have an analysis on the foreign policy issues. And sadly, there are many feminists who do that work. What we don't see them is being asked in the media for their analysis, so our voices aren't being heard at a global level. And I think if they are heard, we would have much more impact. So I think getting our voices out so that more and more people hear it is another important act for us to take.
And maybe just one more thing to add on that is that when there are leaders who take action for feminist foreign policy, for example with Sweden, it's really important to give them support and make calls for more states to do likewise and to further strengthen any action in that regard. Because it's easy to get stranded and left by yourself by claiming a feminist agenda, but we want to show the world that a feminist agenda is a human agenda, women's rights are human rights, and we really need to flip this war system if we're going to make some change.
Totally agree.
Yes, thank you. That was a great way to wrap up the session today. So thank you so much to everyone for your questions and a very interesting discussion. And a special thanks, of course, to Abigail, Ruane, and Radhika Balakrishnan, our speakers today. Thank you for your excellent presentations. And if you are interested in this topic, another member of the WILPF Academic Network recently wrote a blog on feminist strategies for implementing the Sustainable Development Goals. There were quite a few questions about it, so you can find it on WILPF website. And maybe just to add to it, that about a year ago or over a year ago, we also had a webinar on the political economy, specifically of violence against women, by another member of the academic network. So you might be interested in checking that out as well. So that's it for today. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.